Good morning. Here we are 3 days after Easter. And if you were in church on Easter Sunday, you know that there's a special kind of joy that comes with being in worship with other Christians on Easter Sunday, because we are celebrating the most momentous, most powerful, most life-changing event in the history of the world, and that is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So as we come together on Easter Sunday and the joy that we experience begins to overflow in our lives, and we leave there sort of basking in the afterglow of the resurrection of Christ. That's the way I felt. I took Monday off. I always take Monday off after Easter every year just because I need that break. But yesterday was just a kind of a special day of reflection for me as I reflected back and thought back on our time together in worship. There's a wonderful story we find in Luke, the 24th chapter. It's a story of the road to Emmaus. And the story is of two men walking down the road, and they encounter a stranger. And they begin to tell this stranger about the things that they had seen about Jesus, how he was crucified and all that happened to him. And they were telling the story, and they were kind of bewildered about the whole thing, had a lot of questions in their own mind, as even people today have a lot of questions about the resurrection. And so they didn't recognize who this stranger was. Later on, we find out it was Jesus. But they didn't recognize, and suddenly the stranger begins to tell them from the Old Testament prophecies what was to happen and why it happened, and that Jesus was raised from the dead. And he sort of filled them in on all the details. And they continued along on the road, and the men were just sort of amazed at the knowledge of this man. So much so that when they arrived at Emmaus, they invited this stranger to come inside and to have a meal with them. And so they sat down at the table, and Jesus offered the blessing. And it says in that moment that his eyes were opened, that their eyes were opened, that they suddenly realized that this was Jesus, the Christ, that they were walking with on the road. And, you know, it's an amazing story. It's an interesting story, but it's also a story that reflects upon a lot of what we experience from day to day in our own doubts, our own discouragement, and how the resurrection of Christ lifts us out of that discouragement. I think of the early church, the early believers in the first, second, and third century churches, and how they were under a great deal of persecution. They experienced hardships every day. But every Sunday, every Lord's Day, they came back together. And you know what they celebrated every single Lord's Day? From what we know from historians, they celebrated the resurrection. Every Sunday was Easter. Every Sunday was the hope of the resurrection. And I hope that in your life, whatever you might be experiencing, some of you might be experiencing declining health as you age. Some of you might be experiencing cancer. You might be experiencing the loss of a job or a loss of a loved one, or it could be anything. You might just be frustrated. You might just be depressed or discouraged or whatever it might be. But I hope that you will recognize that every day is a resurrection. Every day is us celebrating the new life that comes in Jesus Christ. And that just like those men on the road to Emmaus, that as their eyes were opened, may your eyes be opened to the resurrected Christ, recognizing what he has done in your life. Go in God's peace. Have a wonderful day. Have a wonderful week. Amen.